Fundamentally, the pandemic has been a test of governance. That such a monumental event will have a huge effect on the world, far greater than the last major such event, the Western financial crisis in 2008. Chinese economy will be a stronger and closer relationship with East Asia. "2020 has been a quite extraordinary year, like no other year I have ever lived with. It's my privilege to be able to talk to you about 2020, but not just 2020. Let's take a look at 2021. Let's also think about the coming decade. From the vantage point of history, certain years are invested with enormous importance, marking, as they do, some kind of turning point, perhaps the end of an era or the beginning of a new one. I expect 2020 to be one of those special historic years. The pandemic has clearly been a highly exceptional event. The manner in which the pandemic has encompassed the whole world, the scale of the disruption, the debilitating economic consequences, the way in which it has tested governments to the limit is unparalleled in peacetime. Indeed, the challenges of war perhaps bear a closer resemblance to those of the pandemic than what we normally experience in peacetime. It is inevitable that such a monumental event will have a huge effect on the world, far greater than the last major such event, the Western financial crisis in 2008. Every economy, bar China's, will start 2021 smaller than it was a year earlier. Most countries will face much higher unemployment, will be confronted with huge increases in their debt. Inequality has grown dramatically. Young people, the biggest sufferers, have lost close to a year's education. These consequences have been far from uniform across countries. The most striking divergence is that between East Asia on the one hand and the West on the other. Much of East Asia, most notably China, has been far more successful at eliminating COVID-19. Economic disruption across most of East Asia, as a result, has been much less and of shorter duration. At the end of 2020, the vast majority of the West finds itself still mired in the pandemic, while China, in contrast, has already been growing rapidly for several months. Unlike the 2008 financial crisis, which was primarily economic in nature, the pandemic has, first and foremost, been a test of governance. Indeed, without a vaccine, it is very doubtful whether the West would ever be able to eliminate the virus. The reasons are fundamental. Governments have lacked strategic clarity. They are shorn of the necessary levers of power. They are ill-informed. They do not enjoy sufficient support amongst the people. They have constantly yo-yoed between fighting the pandemic and reviving the economy. There are endless debates about individual rights versus the role of government, while social cohesion and solidarity amongst the people have been too weak to foster and sustain the necessary social discipline. In other words, in the face of a new and profound crisis, Western societies have displayed a fundamental lack of resilience. Hitherto, this has overwhelmingly been seen and calibrated in economic terms. No longer. The pandemic, in stark contrast, has fundamentally been a test of governance. History will come to see 2020 as the year of the Great Transition, the moment when large numbers of people around the world came to see China as the exemplar. Accompanying this new emphasis on the Chinese economy will be a stronger and closer relationship with East Asia, as illustrated by the recent RCEP trade agreement. Cast your mind back to the rather less significant 2008 financial crisis. The Western economies contracted and took a long time to recover. Real living standards have in many cases barely returned, if at all, to their 2007 level. The huge loss of trust in governments, the governing elites and the political systems, the rise of nationalism and populism, the consequences of the 2008 financial crisis were clearly very profound. But 2008 was a far less damaging event than the pandemic. So imagine what kind of damage might be wrought on the West in the wake of the pandemic. With seriously weakened economies, the abject failure of governance, reduced living standards, mass unemployment, heightened inequality, the loss of hope, and a young generation that has lost out badly, Western societies will be highly troubled, unstable, riven with conflict, inward-looking, volatile and unpredictable to an extent not previously witnessed since 1945. We will see the first signs of this in 2021, but the long-term effects of the pandemic will dominate the West throughout the 2020s, with consequences that we cannot foresee.